All right, welcome to another episode of The Deep Dive, where we do the heavy lifting, sifting through those essential sources, so you don't have to. And today, oh, we've got a big one. We're diving into Immanuel Kant, specifically his account of reason.
Yeah, a giant of philosophy. And I think for anyone really who's into philosophy, Kant's central questions, these are the questions that, keep coming back. Can reason itself give us actual metaphysical knowledge, like insights into reality beyond just our senses? It's something that the rationalists, folks like Leibniz and Descartes, they really champion that view.
Right, right. I mean, can it be the foundation of morality, like guiding our actions? And of course, the empiricists, like Hume, they push back on that. They saw feeling as the kind of prime mover there.
Oh, yeah. Hume, he famously said reason is wholly inactive when it comes to morality.
Yeah.
A pretty provocative claim.
It is. And today we are going to unpack Kant's, carefully constructed responses to these huge challenges. He kind of charts a course between like the rationalists' complete confidence in reason and the empiricists' skepticism about its power, both in metaphysics and ethics. So lots to cover.
Absolutely. And
Right.
to make it a bit easier to follow, I think we should follow the structure of the SEP entry on Kant.
Okay, sounds good.
So we'll start with Kant's concept of theoretical reason, how it shapes our understanding of the world and its limits when it goes beyond what we can experience with our senses. Then we'll move on to practical reason. Really dig into his ideas on morality and this central idea of pure practical reason. And finally, we'll tackle that tough question, how Kant saw these two sides of reason, the theoretical and the practical, as unified. It's been the subject of so much debate.
Yeah, a lot of debate. Okay, well, let's dive in. Let's start with theoretical reason. So Kant says, in the critique of pure reason, our real knowledge about the world, it comes from this interplay. Our senses give us the raw data, right? And then our understanding, it uses concepts, he calls them categories, to structure this data. And it's from this combo that we get actual empirical knowledge.
What's really interesting is how he deals with a classic philosophical problem.
Hmm.
Like, how do we know if a belief is true or false in this system?
Right.
So he makes this key distinction, right? Our senses don't actually make mistakes.
Yeah.
They don't make judgments, so they can't be wrong. Like if you see a blurry shape in the distance, that sensory input itself, it's not wrong.
Right.
The mistake comes when your understanding jumps in and says, oh, that's my friend. And then it turns out to be like a bush or something.
So it's not the perception, it's our interpretation that can be wrong.
Exactly. It's like when you're dreaming. The dream itself, it's not a mistake of your senses. The problem is if you wake up and think, oh, that really happened.
Right, right, right.
Kant says the error happens because of the unnoticed influence of sensibility on understanding. You kind of mix up the subjective, what you felt in the dream, with the objective, what actually happened in the world.
Makes sense.
And in the Prolegomena, he goes deeper into this. He said the difference between a true experience and a dream, it's not in the raw data, right?
Right.
Because that can be the same. The difference is in how those representations fit with the rules that make up our concept of an object and how they connect with our whole experience of reality.
So it's all about the coherence of the experience, whether it fits into the bigger picture.
Right.
And this leads to that famous refutation of idealism.
Oh, yeah. One of Kant's key moves. He says, to figure out if an experience is real or just our imagination, you got to check its specifics. And importantly, how well it hangs together with everything else we experience, like
Yeah.
all our real experiences.
So take that lottery winner example again. If they wake up and start doubting, they have to check if that belief fits with the rest of their reality. Do they have the ticket?
Yeah. Does their bank account show the money? Is it on the news? If those connections are missing, then the belief falls apart. It just doesn't fit into their experience or anyone else's.
Makes sense. So this brings us to reason itself. Kant gives this dense definition. He says reason is the faculty of the unity of the rules of understanding under principles. Okay, so break that down for a fellow philosopher. What's the key takeaway here?
It's all about the idea of a single, unified experience of the world. That's the goal. Theoretical reason, it's this drive for consistency across all our judgments. Think of it like a detective, It's looking for factual errors by checking if our beliefs fit with this big picture of reality. If something doesn't fit, reason's like, hold on, that might be a mistake. So it's not just about judging things one by one, it's about how they all connect.
I see. So reason is looking for this overall coherence. And how does that play out in science?
Well, the principle of reasoned unity, it applies to scientific judgments too, but in a more complex way. Because science, it aims for these universal laws, right? Kant says reason is what gives us some of these concepts and principles that go beyond what we get from our senses and basic understanding. He calls them transcendental ideas, or sometimes ideas of pure reason. He even defines reason as a faculty of principles.
But aren't these ideas of reason the ones that can also lead us astray, like into errors and contradictions?
Exactly. One way we go wrong is when we try to know things beyond any possible experience, like the nature of God or the soul. Another is when we form these transcendental ideas about the whole universe, trying to grasp the totality of things. Kant says when we claim to know things in these areas, we run into contradictions. He calls them antinomies.
Like his famous example of the universe having a beginning in time, we can argue for it and against it with seemingly good reasons.
Right. It's not just that we're making mistakes. He's showing us something about reason itself. When it deals with stuff beyond our experience, it creates these conflicts. It's built into how we think.
Okay, so science stays within the realm of experience, searching for those causal laws to explain things. But reason wants to push further. It wants those ultimate explanations.
Right. And scientific inquiry, it assumes that the world is this well-ordered system
Yeah.
where everything can be explained by causal laws. And it's not just saying every event has a cause.
Right.
That's a category of understanding.
Yeah.
Reason is pushing for the idea that there are universal laws behind all those individual cause and effect relationships.
And his example of Copernicus is great for this,
Sure.
moving from Earth at the center to the sun.
Yeah, initially, that went against what we saw, right? But what's cool is Galileo's telescope, it gave us new data. But the reasoning itself wasn't completely new. When we have these conflicting appearances, like what we see with our eyes versus the telescope, we got to figure out which view makes more sense. It's the same type of reasoning we use when we spot an optical illusion or realize, wait, that vivid memory, that was actually a dream.
And then, of course, Kant gives Newton huge credit for unifying the work of Copernicus and Galileo with his laws of gravity.
Yeah, Newton's achievement was huge. His laws applied to everything, not just the Earth and Sun. But here's a key point for Kant, and it's about the limits of theoretical reason. Our experience, no matter how much, it's always finite, right? We can never observe every single event.
Right.
So experience alone, it can never prove with absolute certainty that scientific laws are truly universal or that they'll always hold true in the future.
So there's this important distinction. Are these principles, like the search for universal laws, are they like rules that shape our experience itself, or more like guidelines for our investigation?
Yeah, that's the difference between what Kant calls constitutive and regulative principles. Constitutive, those are like the categories of understanding, like causation. They shape how we experience the world. We can't even perceive things without assuming cause and effect. We might get the specific cause wrong, but we just know everything has a cause. But regulative principles, like that drive for complete systematic laws in science, they guide our inquiry, but they don't tell us how reality has to be.
So, like, Newton's laws were later refined by Einstein and relativity. It's a good example of that open-endedness of science.
Exactly. And scientists are still working on unifying general relativity and quantum mechanics. It's that regulative ideal pushing them.
So it's like we can't know beforehand if nature is completely law-like.
Yeah.
That idea, it's not a fact about the world, but a principle guiding our search.
Precisely. And Kant gets into this more in the critique of the power of judgment with his ideas about teleological judgment. But sticking with theoretical reason, that distinction between constitutive and regulative, that's key. But now, let's turn to those limitations Kant puts on reason. Maybe his biggest contribution in the first critique.
Yeah, he really took apart those traditional proofs for the existence of God and the soul, those sections on the ideal of pure reason and the paralogisms.
And not just that. He showed how we can make equally strong arguments for contradictory claims about these big world wholes, like his famous antinomies. We can argue space is finite and that it's infinite, and both seem convincing. The existence of a first cause, we can argue for and against it. And then, of course, freedom versus determinism, that old chestnut.
It was a huge deal back then. Mendelssohn even called Kant the all-destroyer.
Yeah, it really showed the boundaries of what we could know with metaphysics alone. But those critiques, as important as they are, they weren't just meant to tear things down. Kant wanted philosophers to really understand reason itself, the tool they were using. He wanted to get rid of this idea that reason could give us knowledge about things totally beyond experience. That belief had led to endless debates going nowhere, and it made people skeptical about reason in general. He wanted to show that, yeah, theoretical reason has limits, but it's not useless. Philosophical reasoning can justify some claims, like those about empirical truth or scientific principles. And of course, it has that practical role, which we'll get to.
I like how he uses the story of the Tower of Babel as this analogy for all these conflicting metaphysical claims. Like, everyone's trying to reach for this knowledge beyond experience, but they end up speaking different languages and it all falls apart.
Exactly. And there's no shared way to test these transcendent ideas. So people might use the same words, but mean completely different things. It just leads to disagreements and potentially even conflict. Kant also saw the danger of unreasoned authority stepping in to settle these disputes, whether it's the ridiculous despotism of the schools, he said, in metaphysics, or in practical life, like with Hobbes, where the sovereign just imposes order by force.
And that leads us to his famous line in the preface to the second edition of the Critique: "I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." It's a statement that really sticks with you.
Yeah, it's powerful. He's saying we can't have knowledge of the world as a whole or of things like an immortal soul or God just by using theoretical reason. Our knowledge is limited by what we can experience, but he's also saying that knowledge isn't the only goal of reason. What's really important is our place, our role in the world.
So he's shifting the focus from just knowing things to what we should do.
Right. He contrasts, the scholastic view of philosophy, all about knowledge, with this cosmic view where it's about our place in the universe.
And that's where his three famous questions come in. What can I know? What must I do? And what may I hope?
Exactly. We've covered the first one, knowledge is limited to experience. The second one, what we must do, that's his moral philosophy, especially the groundwork and the critique of practical reason. And about hope. He doesn't say a ton in the first critique, but he sets it up. He argues that knowing about God and a future world, not only can we not do it, but it would actually be bad for morality. Because then we'd be acting for rewards and punishments, not for the sake of doing the right thing.
Right, we wouldn't be truly free in our choices.
Exactly. But he does suggest we have good reasons to hope for these things. Reasons connected to our freedom to act morally, which he gets into more in the second critique.
Now, this idea of reason having needs or interests, that can sound a bit strange. What did Kant mean by that?
It's about the conditions reason needs to work well, especially for us, finite beings. Our reasoning isn't perfect or always clear to us. We can easily rationalize things or think we're being perfectly logical when we're chasing these impossible metaphysical truths.
Ah, I see.
So reason has this need to understand its own limits, to make sure it's actually valid. As one scholar put it, reason needs to present itself to itself, to become aware of how it works and especially what its own basic principles are.
So the critique of pure reason isn't just about dismantling old metaphysics. It's also about reason taking a hard look at itself.
Exactly.
Kant famously said his work puts metaphysics on the sure path of a science. How did he see his philosophy in relation to, like, math or the sciences?
He was clear that math couldn't be the direct model for philosophy. Math, it can build on these a priori objects and axioms, things we grasp through pure intuition, like the idea of a line or a triangle. But philosophy can't just assume these kinds of intuitions about metaphysical stuff. He thought trying to do that just led to these fragile houses of cards.
And empirical science wasn't the perfect model either, right?
Right. Science investigates the world of experience, but experience alone can't reveal things like freedom, which are beyond the senses. And it can't give us that sense of necessity that Kant thought was part of metaphysical truths. Experience shows us what happens, but not what must happen. Though it's worth noting, he did recognize that scientific laws themselves have a kind of metaphysical quality, their universality. That's why he wrote the metaphysical foundations of natural science, to give them that philosophical foundation.
Right, right. But he does use this language of science and experimentation to describe his own work, especially in the preface to the second edition.
Yeah, it's interesting. He sees reason as acting like a judge, approaching nature with these principles, kind of like hypotheses, and then testing them. But in philosophy, the experiment is internal. It's on reason itself. He says philosophy deals with what reason brings forth entirely out of itself once it discovers its basic principle. And he points to those three big ideas, soul, world as a whole, and God, as the places where reason makes its biggest mistakes, mistakes that come from the very nature of reason itself.
I see. So it's reason examining itself, and he keeps hinting at this common principle without really saying what it is.
That idea of reason doing an experiment on itself, it can be a bit puzzling.
It can.
It gets clearer with his famous analogy to Copernicus. Copernicus realized that to understand how the planets move, you have to consider that the observer, us on Earth, are also moving. Kant says, to really understand our experience, we have to account for our own standpoint as humans with our specific ways of knowing. Our knowledge, it has its own structure and limits. This is a big difference from those pre-Kantian views. They assumed we could have this, objective view, independent of the knower. Kant thought that ignoring the human perspective, it led to all these philosophical problems,
Hmm.
like the idea of a soul interacting with a body, something he poked fun at in dreams of a spirit seer. These problems just led to an unavoidable conflict of reason with itself, like in those antinomies.
Okay, so this critical examination of reason is itself an act of reason. Doesn't that sound kind of circular?
That's the heart of the critique. It's reason examining itself. And Kant knew he couldn't just assert the authority of reason, especially with all the mistakes in metaphysics. He had to defend reason against skepticism, figure out its boundaries and its real authority, and he had to do it without relying on claims that were themselves questionable. That's where this common principle comes in. It's essential for reason to justify itself. But yeah, he doesn't give us a complete answer in the first critique. It's a puzzle he keeps working on.
Okay, so we've tackled theoretical reason. Now, let's move to the other big part of Kant's system, his moral philosophy. The groundwork and the critique of practical reason really lay this out. And at the center of it all is the categorical imperative.
Right. Kant calls it an imperative because it's like a command. For us, we're not perfectly rational. We've got needs and inclinations. And it's categorical because it applies no matter what. It guides our actions, whether we feel like it or not.
And the first formulation, it's probably the most well known. Act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that become a universal law. He gives other versions too, but they all mean the same thing. And Kant thought this principle, it's already there in our everyday moral reasoning. We just need philosophy to bring it out clearly.
Right. And he contrasts this with what he calls hypothetical imperatives. So they're like, if you want X, then you got to do Y. A lot of philosophers, especially after Hume, they saw this instrumental way of thinking as the core of practical reason.
Okay.
But for Kant, hypothetical imperatives, they're just about logic. If you have a goal, you got to use the right means to get it. It's about being consistent, but it doesn't really demand anything from us. We can always just give up the goal,
Yeah.
right? And then we don't have to do anything. But the categorical imperative, it's different. It gives us an end that every rational being has to adopt, no matter what they want or what their situation is. It boils down to respecting all rational beings as ends in themselves. And he's adamant that this command, it comes from reason itself and nowhere else.
So hypothetical imperatives are like logical deductions. If this, then that. But the categorical imperative is making a much stronger claim.
It is. It's saying you must act in a way that could be universalized. Your own desires don't get to decide that.
Okay. Now, one of the toughest parts of Kant's ethics is this link he makes between freedom and the categorical imperative. He says they reciprocally imply each other. So let's unpack that. How does freedom imply moral constraint?
The heart of his argument, which he develops more in the Critique of Practical Reason, is this. If we're truly free to step back from our immediate desires, then those desires can't be the ultimate reason for our actions.
Right.
They can motivate us, sure,
Yeah.
and explain our actions after the fact. But they don't justify our actions in a way that everyone else should accept.
Like the classic example of cutting in line. My desire to get to the front faster, that might motivate me to cut. And to someone watching, it might explain why I did it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it right. My wants aren't more important than anyone else's in line.
Exactly. So the question is, how do we find reasons for acting that everyone should accept? Kant's answer is, we need to appeal to the mere form of giving universal law. This takes us back to that categorical imperative. We should only act on principles that we could will to become universal laws. This principle, it's unconditional. It comes from reason itself. And when our actions pass this test, that's when we've done our duty. And importantly, our actions are justified. For Kant, duty and justification, they're inseparable.
But how does this abstract form of law tell us what our duty is and what's justified?
Two things are key. First, form of law means you need some kind of policy, a principle guiding your actions. Without that, your actions would be random, meaningless, even to you. Second, it's about giving universal law. Moral justification, it's not just about following your own personal rules. It's about giving reasons that other rational beings should also be able to endorse. And Kant says the only kind of policy everyone can adopt is one that respects this form of universal law.
He uses the example of Epicurus, right, who said, we should always follow our desires. It sounds like a principle, but Kant says it's not enough.
Yeah, it looks like a general rule, but really it's just telling you to go with your own subjective whims. And desires change, they clash with each other. So first, you can't really follow that consistently. Your own will would contradict itself. And second, if everyone just followed their desires, it would be chaos. No one could reliably satisfy their wants. It's a contradiction to want that to be a universal law for everyone.
So a policy based on just individual desire, it's unreasonable because it puts one person's wants, which are temporary and inconsistent, above everything else. And that leads to Kant's idea of heteronomy, right? Being
Right.
ruled by something outside of reason,
Actually,
our desires, or even external authorities.
exactly. Heteronomy can't give us real moral justification because it relies on these assumed or imposed authorities. They're open to question. Real justification, for Kant, it needs autonomy. That's self-governed reasoning, where reason finds its principles within itself. And the categorical imperative, with its focus on universalizability in this form of law, that's what represents autonomous practical reason.
Now, some people might wonder, is this form of law really enough to guide us in real life? Things get complicated.
Kantians would say, gives us a huge constraint. We have to avoid thinking or acting in ways that couldn't be adopted by everyone. If our actions pass this test, then the autonomy of reason shows us the positive side of freedom. It's the ability to act without being determined by all those things that make us different, our particular desires and circumstances. And this freedom lets us justify our actions to each other, using shared principles. It's the foundation of ethical communities.
So that's how freedom implies moral constraint. Now, what about the other side of that? How does Kant argue that moral constraint, our sense of duty, implies freedom? This is where his idea of the fact of reason comes in.
Right, Kant famously says that nothing in appearances can be explained by the concept of freedom. Morality, it's part of the world we experience, but it doesn't break any of the laws of nature. Any action we do, we can see it as an event in the world with its causes. So just looking at our actions objectively, like science does, it doesn't prove we're free. So he turns to our internal experience, our consciousness. He uses that example of the prince demanding a false testimony with the threat of death.
Right.
Even under that pressure, the person knows they ought not to lie. And this recognition of a moral duty, Kant says, it shows they can choose to do it, even if it means dying. The moral law, it forces us to think of ourselves as free.
And this leads to the fact of reason, right? That immediate awareness of this moral law, which Kant says can't be derived from anything else. It's just there.
Yeah, and this fact has caused a lot of debate. Some see it as a shift in Kant's thinking, like he realized he couldn't deduce morality from freedom, so he appealed to this basic fact of moral consciousness. Others say there's more continuity. He always relied on common moral experience, and there's a parallel with his idea of Achtung, that feeling of respect for the moral law. And the word factum in Latin, it can also mean deed or act, which adds another layer. Maybe it's not just a fact, but an act of reason itself.
Regardless, the main idea seems to be this. When we recognize that we ought to do something, even if it's hard, it shows that we believe we can do it, that we're free in this positive sense. It's the freedom to do what's right. And Kant says we only see this freedom through moral awareness.
Critics might give other explanations for that feeling of constraint. But Kant thought this moral awareness, it gives us a practical certainty of our freedom. It's a factum, proving that pure reason can actually move us to act. And if his argument works, if it's only the categorical imperative that shows us we can act justifiably, then this link between freedom and the moral law, it becomes really powerful.
Okay, so moving on to the connection between these two parts of reason, Kant doesn't give a full picture of how they're unified. But the second critique does have this section on the primacy of pure practical reason. What are his main points there?
He has a few. First, if we accept his critique of metaphysics, theoretical reason can't really access things beyond experience. So there's no higher authority like a traditional God to tell us how to think or act.
Right.
Second, he separates practical reason into two types. Pure practical reason based on these a priori principles and practical reason driven by, desires and inclinations. He sees acting on desire alone as a form of heteronomy. Our will is being determined by something outside of reason. If reason is just a tool to fulfill our wants, like Hume said with that slave of the passions metaphor, then it can't give us these absolute commands.
So neither theoretical reason limited by experience nor practical reason driven by desires can be the foundation of morality. And Kant thought morality does exist, so pure practical reason, that has to be the source.
Exactly. But he goes even further. He says pure practical reason is primary, even for theoretical reason, to guide some of our beliefs.
Okay.
He defines primacy as the prerogative of the interest of one insofar as the interest of others is subordinated to it. And he gives a few reasons for this. One is that every interest, even theoretical reason's interest in knowledge, it all comes back to practical concerns in the end. Another is that pure practical reason, it doesn't depend on our inclinations, like theoretical reason does, which needs the senses and understanding. And finally, when these two interests clash, Kant says the practical one wins.
So, what does he mean by the interest of theoretical reason versus practical reason in this idea of primacy?
Theoretical reason's interest is to know more about the world and avoid mistakes. But practical reason, it's interested in things that theoretical reason can't prove. Specifically, freedom, immortality, and God. Kant says even if theoretical reason can't demonstrate these things, if they don't contradict its principles and they're tied to this fundamental practical interest, our moral duty, then theoretical reason have to accept them.
And that's where the idea of a postulate of pure practical reason comes in.
Exactly. It's something we can't prove with theoretical reason, but it's connected to a moral law, like the categorical imperative. Immortality, freedom, and God. Those are his three postulates.
Okay.
Freedom is special. We've talked about that. It's established by the fact of reason. But God and immortality, we have to postulate them because of this conflict between morality and happiness. Morality, doing our duty, that's the ultimate good. But happiness is also a natural goal for us as rational beings. Kant introduces this idea of the highest good. It's not just being good, it's also being worthy of happiness. But the complete good, it needs happiness too, and it has to be in proportion to how good we are.
And he argues we can't achieve this highest good alone. Right.
Right, we need a moral world order and a being who can make sure this proportion happens. That's God. So, to have a rational hope of eventually reaching perfect goodness and deserving happiness, we have to postulate God and immortality.
Okay, so to sum up this complex relationship, practical reason is primary. Theoretical reason sticks to its area of knowledge, but it accepts these postulates, not as things it knows for sure, but as necessary assumptions for morality to work. Theoretical reason can only show they're not impossible, but practical reason, our moral duty, demands that we believe them.
Right. Which brings us back to that line about denying knowledge to make room for faith.
Exactly. Now, Kant's arguments for freedom, they're generally seen as stronger, more convincing today. But God and immortality philosophers are more skeptical about those now. Some, like Timmerman, have tried to bring back this idea of God creating a world that aligns with morality as a unifying principle.
But that view isn't widely accepted. Many philosophers today think that making the world moral, that's a human task, not something already built into the universe. Some have even suggested secular versions of Kant's highest good where it doesn't need God.
Right, and this is where Maura O'Neill comes in. She's done a lot of work to find a deeper unity in Kant's idea of reason, focusing on the role of the categorical imperative. Her interpretation is really respected, but it hasn't had as much critical discussion as you might expect.
Yeah.
O'Neill goes back to that idea Kant mentions in the preface to the first critique. This common principle of reason, one that reason itself comes up with. He never says exactly what it is in either edition of the critique. He mentions it again when talking about practical reason, but still without a clear explanation.
Right. But he clearly believes in this unity. In the groundwork, he says, there's ultimately just one reason. It just applies differently to different areas. And in the second critique, he talks about this hope of understanding the unity of reason, theoretical and practical, and to derive everything from one principle. He emphasizes this need for our knowledge to be totally unified. But even though he's confident, he doesn't give us a complete account.
And O'Neill argues that if practical reason is primary and the categorical imperative is its main principle, then logically the categorical imperative must be the main principle of reason as a whole, even though Kant doesn't say it directly.
Right. And she finds evidence for this in that footnote in his essay, What is it to orient oneself in thinking? Kant says using your own reason means asking yourself if you could make your assumptions into a universal principle for everyone to use. It's like the categorical imperative, but applied to thinking itself.
So if the categorical imperative really is categorical, it should apply to everything we do, both thinking and acting.
Exactly. And there's more support for this. His maxims of reason and the idea of public use of reason.
Okay, let's look at those maxims. There are three, right? And they show up both in practical and theoretical contexts. They're closely tied to the categorical imperative.
Right. In the Anthropology, he gives them as practical guidelines for wisdom. Think for oneself, meaning don't be prejudiced. Think into the place of the other. Be open-minded. See things from different perspectives. And always think consistently with oneself.
And in the critique of the power of judgment, he connects these to theoretical reason and this idea of sensus communis, which is like having a community sense when you make judgments, taking into account how everyone else sees things so you avoid being biased.
Exactly. So think for oneself. That's about autonomy, the opposite of just blindly accepting things. Think into the place of everyone else.
Hmm.
That's about being broad-minded. And think consistently. That's tough, but it's what you achieve through the first two. Your claims have to fit together, no contradictions. It means being responsible for your judgments, knowing others will hold you accountable.
It seems like these maxims really spell